The bright lights of Luna Base flickered as another power surge hit the communication. Hansal wiped sweat from his forehead and stared at the massive screens in front of him. The numbers dancing across the displays made no sense at first. But slowly they began to form patterns that made his heart race. He had been working the night shift for 3 years. Now, monitoring deep space communications for anything unusual most nights brought nothing but static and the occasional message from mining stations in the asteroid belt, but tonight was different. Tonight the universe was screaming at him. The signal came from so far away that it should have been impossible to receive it. The computers calculated the distance and showed numbers. That hurt to look at billions of light years away in a galaxy that Earth scientists had only seen through the most powerful telescopes. A place so distant that light from there had traveled since before humans had discovered fire. Hansal adjusted the universal translator that had been installed just 2 years ago, when humanity first made contact with the Centauri Trading Federation. The machine hummed and clicked as it tried to decode the alien language. The process was slow and painful, but gradually words began to appear on his screen. Help us. They were dying, their worlds burning, their children screaming as something terrible swept across their galaxy like a plague of death and destruction. The message was broken, filled with static and fear, but the meaning was clear. An entire civilization was begging for anyone to save them. Captain Somin was sleeping in her quarters when the emergency alarm woke her up. She had commanded Luna Base for 5 years and had never heard the communication alert sound with such urgency. Her military training kicked in as she grabbed her uniform and ran toward the communication center. Her boots echoed through the empty corridors as she moved. The base was quiet at this hour, with most of the crew either sleeping or working in the deep sections where the mining operations continued around the clock. But now emergency lights were flashing, and the few people she passed looked confused and worried. When she reached the communication center, Hansal was still staring at his screens, his face pale with shock. She could see the translated message scrolling across the displays, and her breath caught in her throat. The words were simple but terrifying. We are the gentle collective 5 species who have lived in peace for 10,000 years. We have no weapons, no armies, no knowledge of war. We are dying. The Ravagers came from the darkness between stars, and they consume everything they eat. Our worlds enslave our people, turn our children into food. Somin read the message again, trying to understand what she was seeing. The aliens described themselves as herbivores who had evolved on worlds with no predators, no natural disasters, no violence of any kind. They had achieved space travel through curiosity and cooperation, not through the pressure of survival that had driven humanity to the stars. But now they faced something that their peaceful nature could not comprehend. The Ravagers were described as a warrior race that had turned war into an art form. They moved from galaxy to galaxy, consuming entire civilizations and leaving nothing but dead worlds behind them. The message continued, and Somin felt her hands shake as she read the next part. We have heard legends of a species called humans who live on a world of death and violence. You are said to be impossible creatures who can survive anything, who have turned your violent nature into a tool for protection. Your world is called Earth, and it is spoken of in whispers as the most dangerous place in the universe. Somin looked at Hansal, who was still staring at the screens in disbelief. The aliens had somehow learned about humanity, about their reputation as Deathworlders who could survive in conditions that would kill most life forms. They had heard stories about human military doctrine, about the concept that no one gets left behind. The message became more desperate as it continued. We know you do not know us. We have never met your species, never traded with you, never done anything to earn your help. But we are begging you, please help us. The Ravagers will reach our last worlds in 10 days, maybe less. We have nowhere else to run, nowhere else to hit. Somin activated the emergency communication system and contacted Admiral Dongwook on Earth. The old man appeared on the screen looking tired but alert as she explained what they had received. His face grew grim as he listened to her read the alien message. The Admiral was quiet for a long moment before speaking. This changes everything, he said. If what they are saying is true, then we are looking at genocide on a scale that has never been seen before. An entire galaxy of peaceful species being wiped out by creatures that View all life as either food or Min nodded and continued reading the message. The aliens had included data about their species, biological information that showed they were unlike anything humans had ever encountered. They had evolved without the concept of death from violence. Their bodies were fragile, their minds unprepared for the horror they now faced, but they had also included something else. Information about the Ravagers that made So-Min blood run cold. These were not simple conquerors, but a species that had evolved on a world of constant warfare. They had no concept of mercy or compassion. They viewed the universe as a resource to be consumed, and every other species as either useful or irrelevant. The message ended with coordinates, a location in space where the last of the Gentle Collective had gathered, hoping that somehow, someway the legendary Deathworlders would come to help them. The distance was impossible. The journey would take months, even with humanity. Fastest, ship's Admiral Dongwook made the decision that would change human history forever. Contact every government, every military leader, every space command in the solar system, he ordered. We are calling an emergency session of the Terran Defense Council. This is bigger than any one nation or organization. As So-Min watched the Admiral begin making calls, she turned back to the message, still scrolling across the screens. The aliens had described humans as mythical beings, creatures who could survive in hell itself, who had learned to turn their violent nature into a force for good. She thought about Earth, about the billions of people living their lives unaware that somewhere in the darkness between galaxies entire civilizations were being destroyed by monsters that viewed all life as nothing more than food. She thought about the human military, about soldiers who had sworn to protect the innocent even if those innocents lived in another galaxy. The communication array continued to receive fragments of the message as the aliens kept broadcasting their desperate plea into the void, hoping that someone somewhere would hear them and care enough to help. Captain So-Min stood in the silence of the communication center and realized that humanity was about to face its greatest test. The peaceful species had called them Deathworlders, had spoken of them as legends. Now they would discover if those legends were true, if humans really were the kind of beings who would cross the universe to save complete strangers simply because it was the right thing to do. The message from the Gentle Collective had awakened something in humanity that had been sleeping since they first reached the stars, the instinct to protect those who could not protect themselves, the knowledge that being strong meant using that strength to help the weak. Luna base continued to receive the signal as Earth prepared for a decision that would echo across the galaxy for generations to come. The emergency session of the Terran Defense Council began at dawn in Geneva, with representatives from every major power on Earth gathering in the secure underground facility. Admiral Dongwook stood at the head of the massive table where holographic displays showed the alien message and the impossible distances involved. President Minho of the Korean Federation spoke first, his voice heavy with the weight of decision. The message from the Gentle Collective had been broadcast to every government on Earth, and the response was unlike anything in human history. Some called it madness, others called it humanity's finest hour. The debate that followed would be remembered for generations. General Tae-hyun from the European Space Command outlined the military challenges they would need to commit nearly every warship humanity possessed to a mission that could take months or even years. The distance alone was staggering, requiring supply lines across empty space and communication delays that would make coordination nearly impossible. Prime Minister Soo-jin of the Pacific Alliance raised the question that everyone was thinking: what if this was a trap? What if the Ravagers were using the peaceful species as bait to draw Earth military forces away from home, leaving the planet defenseless against invasion? The risk was enormous and the potential consequences catastrophic, but Commander Ji-hoon, who had fought in the Martian colonial wars, stood up and spoke with quiet intensity. He had seen what happened when good people did nothing, when the strong abandoned the weak. He reminded the Council that humanity had always been defined not by their technology or their weapons, but by their willingness to fight for those who could not fight for themselves. Dr. Yoonji, the lead xenobiologist, presented her analysis of the Gentle Collective. The data they had sent showed species that had evolved in paradise. Worlds with no predators, no natural disasters, no concept of violence. They had achieved interstellar travel through pure scientific curiosity driven by wonder rather than the survival pressure that had pushed humanity to the stars. The biological data was fascinating and terrifying at the same time. The aliens had bodies that were incredibly fragile by human standards. Their bones were hollow like birds. Their skin was thin as paper, and their nervous systems were so sensitive that even loud noises could cause them physical pain. They had never evolved the ability to feel anger or hatred because they had never needed those emotions to survive. General Kyung-soo, who commanded the Solar Defense Fleet, presented the tactical analysis of what they knew about the Ravagers. The fragments of information in the alien message painted a picture of an enemy unlike anything humanity had ever faced. These were not soldiers or warriors in any human sense, but living weapons that had been shaped by evolution into perfect killing machines. The Ravagers had evolved on a world where every day was a battle for survival, where only the strongest and most violent could live long enough to reproduce. They had no concept of mercy because mercy was a luxury that would have gotten them killed. Their entire civilization was built around the consumption of other species and the expansion of their territory. What made them truly dangerous was their hive-mind coordination. The message suggested that individual Ravagers had no independent thought but were controlled by central command organisms that could coordinate millions of soldiers simultaneously. They could execute complex military maneuvers instantly without the confusion and delays that plagued normal armies. Engineer Hyjin worked through the night calculating the logistics of such a massive operation. They would need to establish supply depots across unknown regions of space, maintain communication networks over impossible distances, and somehow coordinate a military response without knowing the true strength of the enemy. The numbers were staggering. They would need to strip Earth of nearly 70% of its military vessels, leaving only a skeleton force to defend the home system. The journey would require more fuel than humanity had ever consumed in a single operation, and there was no guarantee they would arrive in time to save anyone. But something remarkable was happening across Earth as news of the alien plea spread to the general population. The response was overwhelming, and its unanimity. Veterans volunteered to come out of retirement. Civilians demanded to be allowed to help, and every spacefaring nation offered their best ships and crews. The message from the Gentle Collective had awakened something primal in humanity, something that transcended national boundaries and political differences. It was the same instinct that had driven humans to run into burning buildings, to save strangers, to dive into freezing water, to rescue drowning children, to stand up to bullies even when they were outnumbered. Admiral Sangwook, who had overseen the construction of Earth's newest warships, found himself commanding not just military vessels but a volunteer force that included cargo ships, research vessels, and even luxury liners that had been converted for humanitarian use. The mission was growing beyond a military operation into something that resembled a massive evacuation effort. The psychological profiles of the alien species showed beings that had never experienced trauma or loss in the way humans understood it. Their entire concept of death was tied to old age and natural causes. They had no words for murder or war or genocide. The horror they were experiencing was literally beyond their ability to comprehend. Medical officer Dr. Su Young began preparing for casualties that no human doctor had ever treated. The biological data showed that the alien species had completely different physiological systems. Their blood was based on copper instead of iron. Their brains operated on different electrical frequencies, and their immune systems had never been exposed to the kind of pathogens that existed on Deathworld's. Final debate lasted 18 hours, with representatives taking turns to speak about the moral implications of the decision. Some argued that humanity had a responsibility to Earth first, that they could not risk the survival of their own species for aliens they had never met. Others argued that this was exactly what humanity had always been about, that their entire history was filled with examples of people who had sacrificed everything to help others. The great heroes of human history were not remembered for playing it safe, but for taking impossible risks to do what was right. The vote, when it finally came, was not close. Every major leader, every military commander, every representative of humanity governments faced the same choice: protect Earth or risk everything to save strangers who had never done anything for humanity except ask for help. President Minho cast the final vote, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision. The motion passes. He announced humanity will answer the call. We will mobilize every ship, every soldier, every resource we have available. We will cross the void between galaxies, and we will stand between the innocent and those who would destroy them. The room erupted in applause and tears as the weight of the decision settled on everyone present. They had just committed their species to the most dangerous mission in human history, a journey into the unknown to fight an enemy they did not understand, to save people they had never met. Admiral Dongwook stood and looked around the room at the faces of the men and women who would lead humanity into the darkness between stars. Today, he said, we have chosen to be more than just another species struggling to survive. Today we have chosen to be human. The preparation began immediately as Earth military industrial complex shifted into emergency production mode. Shipyards that had been building cargo vessels began constructing warships. Factories that had been making consumer goods started producing weapons and ammunition. The entire planet was mobilizing for war. The message from the Gentle Collective continued to broadcast across the void, a desperate plea growing weaker as their worlds fell one by one to the Ravager advance. But now they would receive an answer that would echo across the galaxy. Humanity was coming. The assembly of the greatest fleet in human history began in the outer reaches of the solar system, where the massive shipyards of Jupiter and Saturn worked around the clock to prepare vessels for the impossible journey. Ships from every nation, every corporation, every spacefaring organization in the Sol system gathered at the staging area near Neptune. Captain Minna stood on the bridge of the flagship, indomitable, and watched through the viewports as hundreds of vessels took their positions. In the formation, the sight was unlike anything in human history. Military dreadnoughts moved alongside civilian cargo ships. Research vessels traveled next to mining barges and luxury liners that had been hastily converted for humanitarian purposes. The diversity of the fleet reflected humanity's greatest strength, their ability to adapt and work together when facing impossible odds. Admiral Sangwook had spent weeks integrating technologies and crew members that had never been designed to work together. The result was an armada that looked chaotic but functioned with surprising efficiency. Engineer Wu Jin had performed miracles in the preparation process, taking ships that had never been meant for intergalactic travel and modifying them for the journey ahead. Civilian vessels received military-grade shields and weapons, while warships were fitted with extended life support systems and medical facilities. The technical challenges were staggering. They needed to maintain a fleet of over 300 vessels across distances that made normal space travel look like a walk around the block. Communication delays would stretch to hours, making real-time coordination impossible. They would be traveling through regions of space that no human had ever explored. Navigator Unesio had the most difficult job of all, plotting a course through the void between galaxies, where there were no stars to guide them, no reference points to mark their progress. The journey would take them through areas of space so empty that the nearest star would be millions of light years away. The crew integration process had been equally challenging. Military officers found themselves working alongside civilian scientists. Corporate executives took orders from government officials, and researchers from different nations had to share their most classified technologies. The normal barriers between organizations had broken down completely. Medical officer Dr. Su Young worked with xenobiologists to prepare for encounters with alien species that might have completely different biological needs. The Gentle Collective had provided detailed medical data about their species, but there was no way to know what other life forms they might encounter. During the journey, the psychological preparation was just as important. Counselor Wu Jin helped crew members deal with the reality that they might never see Earth again. The journey was expected to take months, and there was no guarantee they would be able to return home even if they succeeded in their mission. As the fleet prepared to depart, they began receiving more messages from the Gentle Collective. The signals were growing weaker as the aliens' broadcasting equipment was destroyed or abandoned, but the content was becoming more desperate. The Ravagers had consumed 12 more worlds and were advancing toward the last Stronghold of the peaceful species. The messages included detailed information about Ravager tactics and technology that painted a terrifying picture of an enemy unlike anything humanity had ever faced. These were not soldiers in any human sense, but living weapons that had been shaped by evolution into perfect killing machines. The Ravagers did not take prisoners. Because they had no concept of mercy, they did not negotiate because they viewed all other species as resources to be consumed. They did not retreat because they had no fear of death. Their entire existence was focused on a single purpose: the destruction of all life that was not like them. Captain B.O. Ram, who commanded the destroyer squadron, found herself studying tactical reports that made no sense by human standards. The Ravagers would sacrifice thousands of their own ships to destroy a single enemy vessel. They would ram their forces into defensive positions without any regard for casualties. They fought with a coordination that was impossible for individual minds to achieve. The final preparations took place in the shadow of Earth, where families said goodbye to loved ones who might never return. The departure was broadcast live across the planet as millions of people watched their defenders leave for a mission that defied all logic except the simple human belief that the strong should protect the weak. The fleet began its journey in a formation that stretched across millions of kilometers, with scouts ranging ahead and supply ships protected in the center. The acceleration was gradual to avoid stressing the civilian vessels, but within hours they were traveling faster than any human fleet had ever moved. Lieutenant Colonel Dongmin found himself commanding a mixed force of military personnel and civilian volunteers that included teachers, engineers, artists, and even a few athletes who had insisted on joining the mission. The diversity of skills and backgrounds created a crew that could adapt to almost any situation. The first weeks of the journey were spent in intensive training as military instructors taught civilian volunteers the basics of space combat, while scientists shared their knowledge of alien biology and technology. The learning process was accelerated by the knowledge that their lives and the lives of countless innocent beings depended on their preparation. Communications Officer Jae-min maintained the fragile connection with Earth across the ever-increasing distance. The messages from home provided morale and information, but also served as a reminder of what they were fighting: to protect the planet that had given birth to the most dangerous species in the galaxy was also home to poetry and music and art. The psychological impact of the journey was profound as crew members dealt with the isolation of deep space and the growing realization that they were traveling farther from home than any human had ever gone. The darkness between galaxies was absolute, broken only by the distant light of stars that were billions of years old. As they approached the edge of known space, the fleet encountered their first refugees, small ships barely functional, carrying survivors from worlds that had already fallen to the Ravagers. The stories they told were horrific: entire planets stripped of life, populations enslaved or consumed, civilizations that had existed for thousands of years destroyed in a matter of days. The refugees spoke of the Ravagers with a terror that went beyond normal fear. They described beings that showed no emotion, no mercy, no recognition of other life forms as anything more than obstacles or resources. The peaceful species had tried to communicate with them, to negotiate or surrender, but the Ravagers had no interest in anything except destruction. Commander Yan-Su interviewed the refugees and began to understand the true nature of the enemy they were facing. The Ravagers were not evil in any human sense because they had no concept of good or evil. They were simply following their biological programming to consume and expand. Like a virus or a natural disaster, the refugee ships were integrated into the fleet, providing valuable intelligence about Ravager technology and tactics. The peaceful species had observed their enemies closely during the attacks and had learned details that would be crucial for the coming battle. Dr. Na-young, who served as the fleet intelligence officer, analyzed the information and began to develop new strategies for fighting an enemy that operated on completely different principles than human military doctrine. The Ravagers could not be intimidated or demoralized because they had no individual consciousness to affect. Fleet continued its journey through the void, carrying the hopes and fears of two species toward a confrontation That would determine the fate of an entire galaxy. The human ships moved through the darkness like messengers of hope, bringing the fury of a death world to bear against forces that had never encountered anything like them. As they approached the battle zone, the crew of the Indomitable and every other ship in the fleet prepared for the fight of their lives against an enemy that viewed mercy as weakness and compassion as a fatal flaw. They carried with them the knowledge that they represented not just humanity, but the principle that life was worth defending regardless of the cost. The Deathworld Armada was ready for war. The intelligence breakthrough came when Dr. Na Young finished analyzing the captured Ravager technology in the weeks following the first major battle. Her findings were more terrifying than anyone had imagined. The Ravagers were not just another species seeking to expand their territory. They were a biological weapon system that had been consuming galaxies for millions of years. The data revealed that the Ravagers had originated from a galaxy that had been destroyed so long ago that its light had not yet reached the Milky Way. They had been created by a species that had faced extinction from an unknown threat and had designed the perfect weapon to ensure their survival. Admiral Sangwook gathered the fleet commanders aboard the Indomitable to discuss the implications of the discovery. The holographic displays showed the path of destruction that the Ravagers had cut across the universe. Galaxy after galaxy had been consumed, leaving behind nothing but empty space and dead stars. Captain Minna studied the tactical analysis with growing horror. The Ravagers had perfected their techniques over millions of years, learning to break the defenses of every type of civilization they encountered. They had faced technological species, biological species, energy beings, and mechanical intelligences, and had destroyed them all. The pattern was always the same. The Ravagers would appear at the edge of a galaxy and begin consuming the outer worlds, working their way inward in a spiral of destruction that left no world uninhabited, no species alive, and no trace of the civilizations that had once thrived. Their commander, Yun Su, realized that the intervention of the human fleet had disrupted a process that had been continuing for longer than life had existed on Earth. The Ravagers had never faced resistance that grew stronger under pressure, had never encountered an enemy that could adapt faster than they could evolve. The psychological impact of the discovery was profound. The crew members had joined the mission thinking they were saving one group of peaceful aliens, but now they understood that they were fighting for the survival of all life in the universe. Chief Engineer Hyun Woo began the process of retrofitting the human fleet with technology that combined human innovation with the advanced sciences of the Gentle Collective. The result was a new generation of weapons that could match the Ravagers' destructive power while serving humanitarian purposes. The hybrid technology was revolutionary. Human weapon systems were integrated with alien healing devices, creating tools that could both destroy enemy ships and repair damaged friendly vessels. The peaceful species had contributed their knowledge of biology and energy manipulation, while humans provided their understanding of warfare and survival. The transformation of the fleet took place while they were still in enemy territory, with repair crews working around the clock to install the new systems. The process was dangerous because it left the ships vulnerable to attack, but it was necessary if they were going to have any chance of stopping the Ravagers. Captain Bioram found herself commanding a destroyer that had been equipped with weapons that could disrupt the biological systems of enemy ships. The technology was based on the medical knowledge of the Gentle Collective, but it had been weaponized in ways that the peaceful species had never imagined. The first test of the new weapons came when a Ravager scouting force discovered the human fleet. The engagement was brief but decisive. The hybrid weapons caused the enemy ships to shut down completely, their biological systems unable to function when exposed to the modified energy patterns. The success of the new technology led to a complete revision of human military doctrine. Admiral Sangwook realized that they were not just fighting a war, but developing an entirely new way of thinking about conflict. The traditional concepts of victory and defeat were meaningless against an enemy that viewed all life as resources. The human fleet began to understand that their greatest weapon was not their technology, but their adaptability. The Ravagers had evolved to be perfect killing machines, but they had also become rigid and predictable. They could not change their tactics because change was not part of their biological programming, Lieutenant. Colonel Dongmin discovered that the key to defeating the Ravagers was to create situations that their programming could not handle. The enemy could respond to direct attacks and defensive maneuvers, but they had no response to tactics that combined aggression with mercy or destruction with creation. The breakthrough came when a group of human scientists led by Dr. Yunji realized that the Ravagers were not just biologically programmed, but were actively controlled by a central intelligence that existed. Somewhere in their home galaxy, the individual ships were like cells in a vast organism with no independent thought or decision-making ability. The discovery led to the development of a new strategy. Instead of trying to destroy the Ravagers, the humans would attempt to disrupt their connection to the central intelligence. The plan was audacious and dangerous, but it offered the possibility of ending the threat without having to destroy every single enemy ship. The preparation for the final assault required the cooperation of every surviving member of the human fleet and the refugee species that had joined them. The peaceful aliens contributed their knowledge of biology and energy manipulation, while humans provided their understanding of warfare and tactical thinking. Commander Su Haiyan led the development of specialized weapons that could penetrate the Ravager home systems and disrupt their control networks. The technology was based on the same principles that had been used to create the hybrid weapons, but it was designed to target the biological command structures rather than individual ships. The psychological preparation was just as important as the technical work. Counselor Wu Jin helped crew members deal with the knowledge that they were about to attempt something that had never been tried before. The mission would require them to penetrate to the heart of enemy territory and attack the source of the Ravager threat. The final phase of preparation involved training the refugee species in basic military procedures. The peaceful aliens had no natural understanding of warfare, but they had learned to overcome their fear and their revulsion at violence, because they understood that their survival depended on it. Dr. Su Young worked with alien medical specialists to develop treatments for the injuries that would inevitably result from the final battle. The hybrid medical technology could heal wounds that would have been fatal using traditional methods, but it required precise coordination between human and alien medical teams. The intelligence gathered from deep reconnaissance missions revealed that the Ravager home system was not a traditional star system, but a massive biological construct that had been built around a dying star. The structure was larger than most solar systems and contained the central intelligence that controlled the entire Ravager species. The final battle plan required the human fleet to penetrate the outer defenses of the home system and reach the central intelligence. Before the Ravagers could respond, the mission would be a race against time, because once the enemy realized what was happening, they would throw everything they had at the human fleet. Admiral Sangwook stood before the assembled fleet commanders and delivered the final briefing. The holographic displays showed the target and the planned route of attack. The odds were against them, but the alternative was the extinction of all life in the galaxy. The plan was typically human in its audacity. Rather than trying to destroy the Ravager intelligence, they would attempt to reprogram it using the hybrid technology to free the Ravagers from their biological programming. The mission would require everything humanity had learned about both warfare and compassion. The final preparations were completed as the human fleet moved toward the edge of Ravager space. The ships had been modified with the latest hybrid technology, and the crews had been trained in tactics that had never been used before. The refugee species had been integrated into the fleet structure and were ready to play their part in the final battle. The message that Admiral Sangwook sent back to Earth was simple but profound. We are about to attempt something that has never been tried before. We are going to try to save our enemy from itself. The outcome is uncertain, but the cause is just. The human fleet began its final approach to the Ravager home system, carrying with them the hopes of countless species and the knowledge that the future of all life in the universe depended on their success. The Deathworld doctrine had evolved from a strategy of destruction to a philosophy of salvation. The greatest battle in the history of the galaxy was about to begin. The final assault began in the shadow of the Ravager home system, where the massive biological construct blocked out the light of the dying star at its center. Admiral Suho led the combined fleet of human warships and refugee vessels in a coordinated attack that required split-second timing and absolute trust between species that had never worked together before. The scale of the enemy defenses was beyond anything the human fleet had encountered. Millions of Ravager ships swarmed around the home construct like antibodies protecting a vital organ. The individual vessels were small, but their numbers seemed endless, stretching across space in formations that hurt to look at. Captain Mina watched from the bridge of the Indomitable as the first wave of attacks began. The human ships moved in perfect coordination with the refugee vessels, creating a combined force that used the strengths of both species. The peaceful aliens provided technological support while humans handled the tactical decisions. The battle was fought on multiple levels simultaneously. While the main fleet engaged, the Ravager swarms in spaceboarding parties, led by Colonel Mingyu, fought their way through the living corridors of the home construct itself. The environment was hostile in ways that would have killed most species instantly. The interior of the construct was a nightmare of organic technology, where walls pulsed with alien heartbeats and floors shifted beneath their feet. The air was thick with chemicals that burned human lungs, and the temperature fluctuated between freezing and scorching without warning. But humans had evolved on Earth, a world that had tried to kill them every day for millions of years. The boarding parties pressed forward through conditions that would have stopped any other species, their protective suits and breathing apparatus allowing them to survive in an environment of pure hostility. Commander Yansu led his team deeper into the construct, following the energy signatures that indicated the location of the central intelligence. The passages were defended by creatures that were part machine and part living tissue, biological weapons that had been designed to stop intruders. The fighting was brutal, and close quarters where human training in hand-to-hand combat proved decisive. The Ravager defenders were strong and vicious, but they had no experience fighting an enemy that could think creatively under pressure. The discovery at the heart of the construct changed everything that the humans thought they knew about the enemy. Dr. Na Young was with the first team to reach the central chamber, and what she found there made her question everything they had believed about the Ravagers. The central intelligence was not a computer or a biological brain, but a vast network of imprisoned minds. The Ravagers had not been created as weapons, but had been enslaved by their own technology, turned into biological machines that had no choice but to follow their programming. The revelation was staggering. The individual Ravagers were not evil monsters, but victims of a system that had been designed by their own ancestors. Millions of years ago, the original species had faced extinction and had created a survival mechanism that had become a prison for their descendants. Captain Su Haiyan made the decision that would define humanity's place in the galaxy. Instead of destroying the central intelligence, she ordered her team to begin the process of freeing the imprisoned minds. The technology they had developed could break the control systems and give the Ravagers back their individual consciousness. The process was dangerous and slow. Each mind that was freed went through a traumatic awakening as it experienced emotions and independent thought for the first time in millions of years. Many could not handle the transition and died in the process, while others went insane from the overwhelming sensations, but some survived the transformation, and these first free Ravagers began to understand what they had been doing. The horror of their actions hit them like a physical blow as they realized that they had been destroying entire civilizations without any choice or awareness. The freed Ravagers immediately began helping the human teams to liberate more of their kind. The process accelerated as former slaves became liberators, working frantically to free their people before the control systems could be repaired or reinforced. The battle outside the construct continued with desperate intensity as the remaining controlled Ravagers threw everything they had at the human fleet. The casualties were horrific, but the human crews fought with the knowledge that they were not just winning a battle but freeing an entire species. Admiral Sangwook coordinated the fleet actions while monitoring the progress of the boarding parties. The timing was critical because the freed Ravagers needed protection while they were vulnerable, and the human ships were taking massive casualties from the enemy attacks. The breakthrough came when the first group of freed Ravagers gained access to the control systems and began shutting down the slave programming across the entire construct. The effect was immediate as millions of Ravager ships suddenly stopped attacking and began to drift aimlessly in space. The sight of the enemy fleet falling silent was both beautiful and terrifying. The humans had achieved something that seemed impossible. They had turned their enemies into allies by freeing them from their own biology. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Nearly half of the human fleet had been destroyed in the final battle, and thousands of crew members had died in the fighting. The survivors were exhausted, traumatized, and facing the reality that they might never be able to return to Earth. The aftermath of the battle was unlike anything in military history the freed Ravagers were experiencing emotions for the first time in millions of years, and their reactions ranged from overwhelming gratitude to suicidal despair. Many could not cope with the knowledge of what they had done and chose to end their lives rather than live with the guilt. Dr. Su Young worked with alien medical specialists to help the freed Ravagers adjust to their new consciousness. The process was complicated by the fact that their biology had been modified to suppress emotional responses, and many of them were literally dying from the shock of feeling fear. The first warning came from the scout ships positioned at the edge of the formation. Lieutenant Hanwo was monitoring his sensors when the readings suddenly went insane. Energy signatures unlike anything in human databases appeared at the edge of detection range, moving at impossible speeds toward the fleet captain. Beoram received the alert just as her destroyer squadron was conducting routine patrol exercises. The numbers on her screens made no sense at first. Hundreds of contacts, then thousands appearing from the darkness between stars like a swarm of insects emerging from a disturbed nest. The Ravagers attacked without warning or communication. Moving in perfect coordination, their ships formed geometric patterns that shifted and flowed like living things. The individual vessels were crude compared to human technology, but their sheer numbers were overwhelming. The first engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, but it taught the human fleet everything they needed to know about their enemy. The Ravagers fought with a unity that was impossible for individual minds to achieve. Every ship moved as part of a single organism responding to threats and opportunities. Instantly, Commander Yan Su led his cruiser squadron in the opening battle and quickly discovered that conventional tactics were useless against an enemy that felt no fear. The Ravagers would ram their ships into human vessels without hesitation, sacrificing dozens of their own craft to destroy a single human ship. The human weapons were more advanced, but the Ravagers had numbers that seemed endless. Wave after wave of crude but effective warships swept toward the human fleet like a tide of destruction. Each individual ship was weak, but together they created a force that threatened to overwhelm even the most skilled human cruise captain. Minna watched from the bridge of the Indomitable as the battle unfolded around her. The Ravagers moved with a coordination that was beautiful and terrifying. To watch their ships float around obstacles like water, finding weak points in the human formation with instinctive precision. The first casualties were devastating for morale. The destroyer Soul was rammed by 3 Ravager vessels simultaneously and exploded in a ball of plasma that lit up the darkness. The cruiser Vancouver was overwhelmed by a swarm of small attack craft that stripped away its defenses piece by piece, but the human fleet began to adapt in ways that surprised even themselves. Lieutenant Colonel Dongmin discovered that the Ravagers' weakness was their predictability. They responded to threats in patterns that could be anticipated and exploited by creative thinking. The key breakthrough came when engineer Hyun Woo realized that the Ravager coordination system could be disrupted by attacking their command vessels. The larger ships that controlled the swarms were hidden in the rear of their formation, but they could be identified by their unique energy signatures. Admiral Sang-wook made the decision that would change the course of the battle. He ordered the fleet to ignore the smaller ships and focus all firepower on the command vessels. The strategy was risky because it meant accepting massive casualties from the swarm ships, but it was the only way to break the enemy coordination. The battle became a race against time as human ships pushed through waves of Ravager attackers to reach the command vessels. The casualties were horrific, but the strategy worked. When the first command ship was destroyed, the surrounding swarm fell into chaos. Captain Su Haiyan led the assault on the second command vessel, her heavy cruiser taking massive damage as it fought through the defensive screen. The Ravagers threw everything they had at her ship, but her crew fought with a desperation that came from knowing they were humanity's last hope. The breakthrough came when the human fleet began working together in ways that their training had never taught them. Military vessels provided cover for civilian ships, while cargo haulers rammed enemy formations to create gaps for the warships to exploit. Dr. Su Young found herself treating casualties that no medical training could have prepared her for. The Ravager weapons caused injuries that seemed designed to maximize suffering rather than achieve quick kills. The peaceful species refugees who had joined the fleet were traumatized by the violence, but they helped care for the wounded. The battle revealed the true nature of the conflict between the species. This was not a war between nations or ideologies, but between two completely different concepts of existence. The Ravagers saw the universe as a resource to be consumed, while humans saw it as a place where life should be protected and cherished. Counselor Wu Jin worked around the clock to help crew members deal with the psychological impact of fighting an enemy that showed no mercy, no fear, and no recognition of other beings as anything more than obstacles. The human concepts of honor and courage seemed meaningless against such opponents. The turning point came when the human fleet encountered a group of Ravager ships that were herding civilian refugees toward processing centers. The sight of the peaceful aliens being treated like cattle awakened something primal in the human. Cruise Captain Jae Seung led a suicide run against the Ravager formation, knowing that his ship would be destroyed but determined to save as many refugees as possible. His sacrifice allowed 3 transport ships full of civilians to escape, but the image of his ship exploding in a blaze of light became a symbol of human determination. Rescued refugees told stories that haunted the human crews. They described worlds where the Ravagers had set up processing centers to sort captured beings into categories: those who would be enslaved, those who would be consumed, and those who would be used for biological experiments. The intelligence gathered from the refugees revealed that the Ravagers were not just conquerors, but a biological weapon system that had been created by some unknown species in the distant past. They had been designed to consume galaxies, and they had been doing so for millions of years. Commander Na Yang analyzed the data and discovered that the Ravagers had destroyed thousands of civilizations across multiple galaxies. They were not evil by choice, but by design, genetically programmed to view all other life as either useful or irrelevant. The psychological impact on the human crews was profound. They were fighting not just for the gentle collective, but for the principle that life itself had value, that consciousness and creativity were worth preserving against forces that would reduce everything to raw materials. The battle continued for days as the human fleet pushed deeper into Ravager territory. Each engagement taught them more about their enemy, but also revealed the true scope of the threat. The Ravagers were not just a military force, but a galactic plague that had been spreading across the universe for eons. The human strategy began to evolve as they learned to fight an enemy that operated on completely different principles. They used deception and misdirection tactics that took advantage of the Ravagers' rigid thought patterns. They created chaos in the enemy formations by targeting the command structure. The breakthrough came when a group of human scientists realized that the Ravagers' biological systems could be disrupted by certain frequencies of energy. The discovery led to the development of new weapons that could cause the enemy ships to shut down or even turn against each other. The final engagement of the first phase of the war took place near a dying star system where the Ravagers had established a forward base. The human fleet attacked in a coordinated assault that used every lesson they had learned about fighting a hive-mind enemy. The battle was won, but at terrible cost. Nearly a quarter of the human fleet was destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The survivors were exhausted, traumatized, and facing an enemy that seemed to have unlimited numbers, but they had also achieved something that no other species had ever managed. They had disrupted the Ravager advance and forced them to reconsider their tactics. The peaceful species had been given time to evacuate their remaining worlds, and the galaxy had been shown that the destroyers were not invincible. Admiral Sang Wook stood on the bridge of the Indomitable and looked out at the wreckage of the battlefield. The Space around them was filled with the debris of both human and Ravager ships, but the human fleet still existed and still fought. The message he sent back to Earth was simple but profound: we have engaged the enemy and survived. They are not invincible. They can be fought, and they can be defeated. The cost is high, but freedom is worth any price. The first battle with the Ravagers was over, but the war for the survival of all life in the galaxy had just begun.